Hi, Abdi. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had actually been waiting to have this conversation ever since I got my hands on this gorgeous book of yours. And
Oh,
it's funny because I got this almost a year ago and it had been lying on my shelf because so many people told me that this is about AIDS and it's sad and it's whatnot. And I was like, with COVID around, am I really in the position to read a sad book? So I kept delaying that until one day I decided that wait a second, it's too much. I already had COVID, I recovered. So now is the time that I read this book. Like if I don't read it now, I don't know when I would. And introduce yourself to the Indian, readers who'll be watching this mostly. So a little about yourself and then of course give us the introduction to the book.
sure. And by the way, this is so cool that the book is even being read in India for me. This is my first time interacting with Indian readers, so I'm really honored. My name is Abdi Nazemian. I was born in Iran, and I left Iran when I was two, about the time of the revolution. I moved quite a bit as a kid, so I lived in France and Canada, and then my family came to the United States at age 10. So for anyone who has read Like a Love Story, they might recognize a bit of the history and the character of Reza, who
Right.
does mirror. The book is very much a novel and fiction, but I often call it like an emotional autobiography in that
Mhm.
the emotions I'm describing, especially for Reza, were very much the ones that I felt at the time. And yeah, and I've been a writer for decades now. And I started in film and television. I moved to Los Angeles right out of college because I loved film and TV, and I still do. That's still my day job, how I spend most of my time. But I started writing books primarily because I found it so difficult to get the movies I was writing and TV pilots I was writing about the Iranian community were always the ones that somehow didn't get made. They would often be the ones that got me a job writing another movie
Right.
or on a TV show, never about Iranian characters. And like, I don't know, maybe I'm very bad with time, but I think it was about 10 years ago, about the time my kids were born. I have two kids who are both almost 10. And I just had this very strong feeling that I didn't want to end my writing career never having represented my community or told my story, the things that I felt I really had to say. And, I sort of started to dream that maybe as an author, there would be less barriers to entry in telling the story because you don't need movie stars and millions of dollars to get a book published. And luckily, I was right. It turned out to be like one of the best decisions I ever made. I'm now, God, I don't want to get this wrong. I'm about to have my fourth book published. Every single one somehow represents the Iranian community and specifically the Iranian queer community who had
Right.
virtually never been represented before these books. I don't want to wipe away everyone. Like Sarah Farizan is a great author you should know, who
Mhm.
was writing before me. But I believe my first book was the first, I've been told by academics, the first novel to ever have a gay Iranian male as its lead character, which is pretty
Right.
crazy because you're talking
It
very
is.
recent.
It
So,
is.
anyway, so that's my, I guess that's me in a nutshell and what I'm passionate about, but I'm excited to see what you're interested in talking about. And
Right,
yeah.
right. Could you also quickly, without spoiling, give us a little bit
Oh
about the
God.
book?
Yes, sorry. Sorry. Thank you for holding the book up. I, like an idiot, don't have it handy.
No, no, I'm doing the honors. Yeah, yeah.
There it is. So Like a Love Story is my the latest of my books that came out. It's a story of three teenagers, Reza, Art, and Judy, who meet at a New York high school. The story kind of gets started when Reza moves to New York with his mom.
Mhm.
He's Iranian. He's dealing with a lot of shame and fear because he's coming to terms with the fact that he's gay.
Mhm.
Um, Deeply closeted, living in the culture. Remember, this is the 1980s. He's living in an Iranian culture that has no examples of queer life for him to look up to or to define himself. And he's also moving to the United States at the height of the AIDS epidemic in New York City, when a lot of the messaging was about fear, paranoia, stigma. And so, when he meets Art and Judy, Art is out and proud, and Judy is an ally and she's creative. He starts to open up, and there's a love triangle at the center of the story. But for me, and the reason it's called Like a Love Story is not just because it's homage to Madonna, who the
Yeah.
title
Yeah.
plays off of. But it's also because for me, it's not, the love story is not, the real love story of the book is not the romantic love story. To me, it's always been a love letter to the queer community,
Right.
to activists and the artists who were bold enough to stand up for us in the late 80s and early 90s when virtually nobody would. And the effect it
Right.
had on kids like me who were growing up with so much shame. And so really that's always been for me the real love story of the book is the sense of community that it celebrates.
That I've read the book enough to be able to kind of, see that already. And I
Yeah.
feel that, the way a lot of people told me that this is going to be sad is quite, taking it a little too far. Because
Mm.
the way I was told, I felt that this is only about AIDS. But I mean, in hindsight, it is about AIDS, but it's also about a lot of other things. It's about life and how you live life while AIDS was still on. I mean, the biggest crisis was still on. So I completely get what you're saying when, it's dark, but it's also at the same time, has that life to it where the readers are able to, see both sides of the spectrum and just
Mm.
basically, taste life as it was back then.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
completely. So, you've mentioned so many times that this, is a love letter, and I mean, you wanted to set it in the late 80s and 90s. So, if you are a little bit aware, currently there is a discussion that is kind of going on in the book community where a lot of readers, for some reason, they believe that while writing or approaching historical fiction, historical accuracy is not really the thing. And to give you a little bit of context, recently, Benjamin Alire Sons, who's one of my all-time favorite authors for
Me
Aristotle and Dante.
He was a big inspiration for me even writing YA
Right,
novels. The kind
right,
of Is that right? So I would like to second your admiration. Yes.
right. So he kind of recently come under a little bit of I would not say attack, but like opposition of some sort, where people started saying that there is a like a narrative around transvestite people, which is slightly transphobic in hindsight, and that it could have been easily omitted out of the work. To which Benjamin has replied and responded on Twitter, and this is something which is there, like somebody can go back and do the research if they want to. He replied saying that to give a 2021 perspective to something that happened in the 80s would be untrue. To which people have said that why do you want to give something which is negative? So my question to you is, because you've written a historical fiction and because you're somebody who's lived through a lot of long times. So where do you stand on that debate? Like, do you think that historical fiction should omit parts where it is where you feel that it's becoming too much? Like, is it okay to erase the trauma, the whatever, no matter how bad it is, just because today people no longer want to speak about it?
This is a very big question. Okay, I want to start by saying two things. Number one, I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter,
Yeah,
and I love Aristotle and Dante. I'm very excited for the sequel. It was
me
a
too. Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful book. I didn't know about this, and
Mhm.
without knowing enough about it and what the context is and what was in the book, it's hard for
Mhm.
me to comment on that. So I'm going to just
Yeah,
politely say I can't comment on that because
sure.
one thing I'm very passionate about, and one reason I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter is I do believe that people should only comment on things they really know about and are really educated about. And
Yeah.
I would be speaking out of turn to even say anything
Mhm.
without doing my research on the
Mhm.
two sides. Obviously, I am a huge proponent of empathy and humanism, and I hope that in my books people see um, how much I lead with my heart and love for all people. And in raising two amazing 9-year-olds in this new culture, we've already talked to them about every
Right.
kind of identity, human rights all over the world. I mean, it's just really important for me. But when you talk about historical fiction, that's a very complicated thing. I mean, first of all, it's complicated that my book is historical fiction because it's about my childhood. So the
Yeah.
minute people start marketing your childhood as historical fiction, all other questions aside, it's a real it makes you feel a little old. There's that piece of it. But honestly, like I said, there's two kinds of stories to me. There's stories. I don't mind if historical fiction wants to rewrite history in order to present a more hopeful narrative. I mean, I think that there are people who do that very successfully. I mean, a lot of like Ryan Murphy's TV shows do that. They go back to history, but they present it in a slightly different way. And I think it's very effective and beautiful and hopeful, and I applaud it. And at the same time, if a piece of historical fiction chooses to be deeply grounded in reality, which is going to have, the reality is when I was growing up, there was intense homophobia. Much of that homophobia is represented in my book. Like it would, to me, having committed myself to writing a book that was grounded in the reality of my own coming of age, it would have been disingenuous to omit that. So it to me is, it's again, it's like, I believe in additive storytelling, meaning like all storytelling is valid. It's about respecting the intention of the artist, as long as the artist isn't maliciously harming a community or spreading irresponsible untruths. I think we have to be aware of that. And what I hope is that I don't interact too much with people as they respond to my book, but I'm very curious, so I read everything. And I've read enough to know that some people, for example, think that Reza is a horrible character who lies to Art and Judy.
Yeah. I have read those too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I understand that. Like, I understand from the perspective of 2021 that one would think Reza is lying to Art and Judy, because if someone did that today in many communities, maybe it would be seen differently. But what people have to understand is, for an Iranian teenager living in New York in the 1980s, that lie was grounded in so much pain, so much shame, so much self-loathing. And what I hope to do with the book is to create empathy for the flawed characters. They're all flawed. I mean, many readers have problems with the way Art treats Reza, how much he pushes him out of his comfort zone. And again, I agree with those readers. I think Art is deeply flawed, and that's the flip side of Art's passion and activism. Is he can also push too hard when it's not appropriate. But I wasn't interested in presenting perfect characters. These characters are flawed, and they had to be flawed because it was impossible not to be when you were living in a culture that hated you as much as the culture hated me when I was growing up. So to me, it's just all about like storytelling to create empathy. And my hope is that anybody who reads a work of historical fiction and recognizes certain phobias in there, ask themselves, well, are those coming from a place of like the author agreeing, or is it the author presenting them because they want us to understand how hard the world was for these characters, what they had to struggle through? And the rest is up to the readers. I don't like, once you publish a book, it belongs to other people.
The death of the author. Yeah.
People can think what they want. I just hope they approach it with empathy, and if they don't, that's okay too, because
I mean, all opinions are valid. Yeah.
All opinions are valid, and you give up the work. That's why I think artists are so brave, especially these days with social media.
Yeah, where when cancel culture is around and like things just go
whatever you want to call it. But you're getting real-time opinions now, which is whether you call, I don't like, I have a real problem, and I'm, as my life is historical fiction, so I'm older than many of the readers of this book. I don't, all these
that's
words,
so true.
I'm not cancel culture or whatever. I mean, I don't like grouping artistic ideas into like these boxes. Like I worry that we're losing nuance and context.
We are
a lot more nuance and context around this. I applaud people who are talking about human rights, about people who are asking more of storytellers, asking more of industries. Like, that's great. And I like I said, I have no problem with it. I think as an artist, I have to protect myself from that, because my job, like, I don't plot out my books. I didn't know what Like a Love Story was going to be, other than a novel about how it felt to grow up during the AIDS epidemic. Like, my job, I think, is to remain free of that stuff so that I can be open to whatever the story is. I never want to approach a story thinking about the problem someone might have with it, because then it'll be bad, because there will be no artistic inspiration.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of circling back a little bit to a core element in the book, like a love story, which is your love for Madonna. And so I was wondering if you've met her, if she's read your book, if you've been, able to send a copy across to her, and like, what's your personal equation with Madonna in general? Considering
So,
that you work in the industry, otherwise I
yeah.
wouldn't have asked.
So I fell in love with Madonna when her very first video came out when I was 7 years old. I saw her for the first time on tour when I was 8 years old. My parents took me to her very first show, the Virgin Tour. I have seen every tour but one through the years. She has been, I would almost say she was a part of my family growing up. That's how much I was obsessed
Wow.
with her.
Yeah.
Throughout the years, I have almost met her. I have been in the same room with her many times. I actually just posted for anyone who's on Instagram. I posted for the first time in 1990, right when this book came out. I was in France. We moved to France after the revolution. My grandmother stayed there. So I spent a lot of my childhood in France, and Madonna's dancers were staying in the hotel. These were the Blonde Ambition dancers who I write about quite a bit in the book. And one day Madonna was there and I ran down. I didn't get there in time to say anything to her, but I took these photos of her. And for whatever reason, I kept the photos a secret. I barely even showed them to my friends because it felt so personal.
Personal, yeah.
And finally, after having such a beautiful response to the book, and so many people, especially who write to me about the book, talk about how Madonna had the same effect on them and helped to liberate them. I decided to share that photo. But so that's one story. I've almost met her many other times. I've never met her. It is quite difficult to meet Madonna, as it turns out. The book has been delivered to her. I don't know if she'll ever read it. I mean, yes, I work in this industry. I know many people who are very close to Madonna. Many of them have read the book. Many of them have told me they have told her about it or given her the book. But she doesn't interact a lot with the art about her. I mean, I was surprised. Like, I don't know if you guys get the TV show Pose over in India. You do. So there's a great TV show called Pose, which, really intersects with this book in very interesting ways, and that it tells another story of what life was like at that time and touches on ACT UP and touches on Madonna and touches on all the themes, but it tells it from the perspective of a very different community, and it's beautifully made. And anyway, they did a lot of stuff about Madonna, and I was waiting for her to acknowledge that, and she didn't even acknowledge that, which was such a high profile tribute to her. So I don't know, but one of the things I love about Madonna, in addition, obviously anyone who reads the book knows what I love about her activism, the lack of shame, the way that she empowered a generation that was being told to be ashamed of their sexuality and of their innate power, and that she empowered us when nobody else would. But another thing I actually love about her is that she keeps to herself, and she lives her life, and she protects herself, and she's not somebody who's like constantly interacting with fans and I kind of love that. I want her to just be in her life and
I think if I can add, I think now I kind of see parallels as to why probably you're not on Twitter.
Well, probably. I mean, I am on Twitter. I just don't.
Yes, I did tag you, and I'm like, when is he going to receive this? And I'm like, you never did. I'm like, oh, okay. And I did see that you're not that active. You're active on Instagram.
I'm not very active.
Yeah.
No, I'm not very active on Twitter. I'm very active. I made a choice to just choose one piece of.
Instagram community is so much more healthier than Twitter.
Honestly, like I've gotten a couple of not so nice things on Instagram, but for the most part, my interaction with it is kindness. Now I know that Instagram and Facebook are very, very flawed and responsible for many of the political ills of our world.
Yeah.
But for me on a personal level, it felt like a safer space. I mean, I think Twitter is very important for a lot of people. It's just not my platform, and the way people like to interact on it is not really healthy for me.
I can understand. No, it's nice that you mentioned Pose, because when I was reading this book, one of the films that I had watched, I think a couple of years ago, is this film called The Normal Heart, which has Matt Boomer and Mark Ruffalo, and it's around AIDS. And I really loved that film, and it kept reminding me of, so whenever I was reading Uncle Stephen, I don't know, for some reason I was imagining it to be Matt Boomer. And I was like, okay, this is a different picture.
Well, I mean that film is based on a play written by Larry Kramer, who was one of
Okay.
the founders of ACT UP, who is
Oh,
very, integral to my own experience of
right.
finding my power. He was one of the first real outspoken activists that I knew of.
Mhm.
So certainly not a coincidence because he's an inspiration.
I also kind of wanted to circle back on you being an Iranian, born in Iran, raised in different parts of the world. And it's interesting because I think last week I spoke to Adib Kohram for both his books, Darius the Great.
I
And
love he's a very good friend and one of my favorite people in this
yeah,
community.
yeah, I loved both his books. And we spoke at great lengths about, of him being an Iranian and the culture and all that. So I wanted to know for you, how was the experience, considering the fact that you were gay, and I'm pretty sure you realized it early because you said that Reza, like you relate the most to Reza, and Reza is kind of you in the story.
Yeah.
So how was your personal experience growing up as a gay Iranian kid? Like how was your family, if I can ask, and if you're comfortable sharing? So
Yeah, no, I'm a God, I'm an open book, no pun intended. It was very hard. It was very hard. I think I started to realize it's hard to say that I realized I was gay because honestly, I don't know that I knew what gay was, but I realized I was different or that maybe I liked boys like as young as 11 years old.
mhm.
I remember it being about the time I moved to America, which was when I was 10. And it was something I immediately knew was a very shameful thing in the world, both in Iranian culture and in American culture.
Yeah,
I wasn't raised in such a way that I had a lot of exposure to what was happening, in queer rights and queer storytelling. So, which is another reason why like Madonna was really one of my first entry points because she was so mainstream and such a big pop star that we already loved as a family. Once she started to be so overt about including queer life in her work, it was a real mind-blowing opening for me. But I stayed. It's for me coming out is a strange term because it's not something I did at once. It's something that
mhm.
happened over time. It trickled. Like the first person I came out to was an English teacher and then a friend, but then I was kind of still closeted. And then
It's
little
kind
by
of
little,
always the English teachers for some reason.
always, which is a little bit of what my next book is about. Actually, it's a very much more complicated and perhaps
Yeah,
much
yeah.
darker book. But
We will definitely get to that as well. Yeah.
yeah, we'll get to that. But no, the thing with my family is I have a deep love for my family and my
Okay.
culture.
Mhm.
I talk about this all the time when I go to high schools because I think, and again, I've been living in America since I was 10. I travel a lot. I go back to different countries a lot, but I'm now, for better or for worse, an American. And American culture has become a very, very kind of binary black and white culture. And one message I heard a lot when I was coming out, because of course my parents were not immediately accepting or overjoyed. Why would they be? They came from a culture that had no examples of this. They
Mhm.
were scared, they were fearful, they were uneducated about queer life. So it was a struggle. But I never turned my back on them and they never turned their back on me. Was it awkward? Was it difficult? Was it painful? Of course. I felt like I had to come out many times in order for it to stick with my parents. I mean, now, I have two kids. I have a husband. They love my husband and kids. We're a family. We're together all the time. We go stay with them for months.
Wow.
But that's not to say there still aren't issues around me being so vocal, me being so public.
Mhm.
It's tricky. But what I really say to young people and I really believe is like, if unless your family makes you feel unsafe, which is a very different thing, we have to make a distinguishing point
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
which
yeah.
my family never did. They always loved me, even if they didn't understand or love every part of me. But barring your family making you feel unsafe, like I just don't believe in turning your back on people who aren't where you are in their journey of acceptance. I think I had to give my parents the time. It took me a decade to accept myself. How could I have asked my parents to accept me in one conversation? Like it would have been
Beautiful.
completely unrealistic. And so
Realistic. Yeah.
what I've had to do, and I think I do it a lot in my books too, with the older characters, like I think my books perhaps more than some YA books, have a lot of emphasis on the older characters.
Yeah.
Because I've always wanted to also have so much empathy for my parents and for their generation and immigrant cultures who, how can we expect immigrants who come to America from a country not to bring those values with them and to have to work through all those changes? So I have so much respect for people in the Iranian community who had to leave their whole country behind, their culture, their family, their language, their traditions, and learn. And I've seen so much growth. I mean, now, because of my books, I've gotten to interact with a lot of the Iranian community here in the US. And it's amazing. There's so many people who are coming out. There's parents who are becoming accepting. There's support groups just for Iranian queer people and Iranian parents of queer people. There's a whole conversation happening now. And I think that that's because as a culture, we were all patient with each other and we had empathy for each other and we gave each other time to understand. So, I hope that that's a value that we spread across the world, because I think the world needs a little more empathy and understanding.
We do, because it's so interesting that you bring that point up, because I think you would have noticed that specifically in the generation that I am, like 21, I'm 21 years old, and people like
God.
Yeah, I was like born in 2000, so I go by the year.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've seen this this change where people no longer want to wait, like people are not patient enough. And I think in India specifically, because we consume so much of the West, we consume so much of Netflix, we consume so much of, and which is not a bad thing at all. I mean, it might sound it is, but it's not. But what has happened is that the expectations of what people of my age have versus what really is in the culture is a little inconsistent.
Yeah.
So we want to, like, let's say, lose our virginities by the time we turn 18. Well, that doesn't happen, because in Indian cultures there is a thing that until you're not married, you can't really lose your virginity. We have arranged marriages, which is really not a concept in the West. So there's just so many differences which we have. And then when you watch and consume all of this, I think, it just makes you a little bit more West in certain senses in your perspectives. And I think that has kind of, pushed people to, in this space where they don't want to give their parents or their, and I'm including myself in, because there have been so many times when I've not been, enough understanding with them, where I could have been considering that, now that I hear from you that you gave them, like fair enough of time to, understand them.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely
agree. And I definitely think, like what you're saying, it's very interesting, because that piece of my own values and that piece that's in the book is something that is deeply understood, I think, by people who are straddling two cultures. Whether
it is,
as you said, even you as someone in India who lives there, you're consuming Western culture. So we're all now, like, people are often straddling two cultures. For me, it was much more overt. And I was actually, like, the culture I was raised in at home was in opposition to the culture that I was going to school in and the values. So, that's something that I think a lot of people from different countries or people from immigrant cultures recognize and identify with. Sorry, there's someone at my door and their dog is going nuts. Will you give me 1 second?
Please.
I'll be right. Because if I don't answer, hold on. Okay.
Yes. Back. Okay. So, on that note, I wanted to ask, and this is probably too obvious, you are a producer and, you've worked on several projects. So when exactly is this book being turned into a film or a show?
Oh, goodness. As of now, I don't know. I mean, there are two pretty incredible producers optioned it. They're very big producers. I was hopeful that it would get made by, one of many companies that, have the money to make this kind of movie, because it would be expensive given that it's period, it's historical, and there's a lot of music rights involved. And But, as it turns out, the lesson I learned early in my career, which is it's much harder to get a movie made than it is to publish a book. It's just been an uphill battle. I'm not giving up, but there is a chance it may never be turned into a movie. There's a chance the universe will align and it'll happen. But for now, I have to accept that if it doesn't happen, the book is enough and it's reached so many people.
Yeah.
Obviously, the more people that keep reading the book, one amazing thing about this book is that somehow 2 years later, people are still reading it. So, the more that happens, the more chance someone, maybe takes a risk on the movie. But yeah, I hope. This book is a huge success. Like just recently, I guess BuzzFeed, which is a very big thing, whatever website here.
Yeah.
BuzzFeed published a book of a list of books that needed more hype, and my book was on one of them. And it was so funny because the article made it sound like, oh, this is a book that no one's discovered that needs more hype. And in my mind, I'm like, I thought this book was going to come out and go away because it's so niche. It's sad. Like you said, it's sad. It's Iranian. It's queer. I'm like, who's going to want this? So for me, this book is the wildest success of my life to be, I get letters on Instagram virtually every day from people. Some of them are very personal and very long. They're so meaningful about what the book has done for them or made them learn or change relationships they had with their loved ones. How could I not consider that a success? That's huge. Do I wish it was a bestseller or a movie? Of course, but I can't base my definition of success on that.
Well, it is a Stonewall awardee, so.
Well, it's a Stonewall awardee, and look, you have to also gauge success on who you are. I mean, I'm a gay Iranian who writes stories. Show me another, other than Adib, and I mean, in the lane that I'm in, I feel very proud and very successful. So,
and just to add to your credits, I think this book also got featured on Time recently.
Oh, it did. It wasn't that crazy. I freaked out. I did freak out about that. That was crazy.
Yeah, so I did remember going through it, and I was actually in the process of reading the book, and I was like, whoa, this is on Time. And it's like,
I know,
wow.
it made me, the thing that was so cool about that is that, well, other than the fact that it was the Time list of 100 best YA books of all time. So it included books like The Diary of Anne Frank and The Catcher in the Rye and To Kill a Mockingbird. I was like, what? But the best part about that is that when the list came out, we were actually staying with my parents. We spend a lot of time with them. And so we were all with them. And it was so cool because I think many immigrants will identify with this, immigrant parents really, when it's something like Time magazine, something they've read their whole life, it means something very different. So I feel like for my parents, because so much of the success of my book takes place in a world that my parents don't know about, they don't really fully understand the impact.
Right.
But when it was on Time, it was like, and of course, it doesn't matter how old I get, the approval and joy of seeing your parents be proud of you is something I really always seek out.
Right.
Perhaps something I should grow out of, but I probably never will.
So on that note, I wanted to now kind of move away from a little bit of this and get on to your next book. I've already seen the cover. Looks as amazing as this one, very colorful. So tell us a little about it.
So that book is called The Chandelier Legacies. I have copies in my closet. I should probably have had one, but it's,
oh my God, they need to come out of the closet.
They will. It's coming out of the closet in February. That book is after I finished Like a Love Story, I will say it was very hard to figure out what to write next because I felt like a Love Story was for me. I wrote 2 novels before it, and I do love those novels, but I think in a lot of ways they were learning experiences for me to write. Like a Love Story, which is to me just a novel where I dug much deeper into my own self. I wasn't hiding. It's interesting with both previous books I was writing and the lead first person narrator was a woman or a teenage girl. And for most of my career, because I was told in the film and TV industry not to write gay men, I would often write female lead characters because it was the natural way for me to identify. That's who I identify with most, outside of gay men. And Like a Love Story was a real opportunity for me to dig deeper. And so I suppose I had to challenge myself to be like, how do I keep this level of emotional connection. And one of the more impactful in experiences in my life was going to boarding school. So I went to boarding school for 4 years in the 1990s in New England and Connecticut. And it was a very confusing experience, I would say, because it began as, without a doubt, the worst experience of my life. I arrived very, very out of place. I was culturally out of place. I knew I was gay, but was hiding it. There was a culture of abuse there that was not even questioned. Obviously, there was abuse coming from teachers towards students, which was more sexual in nature, but much of what I also experienced was hazing. It was very brutal, kind of physical, often also kind of sexual, hazing. And there was this real feeling that like people knew what was going on, but nobody did anything about it because it was just the way it was. And
Right.
so it was a painful time of my life. But then what happened is, like, over those 4 years, I ended up meeting the people who became my best friends, the
Mhm.
mentor who would show me that I could feel safe enough to come out, safe enough to be a writer. I came from a culture that had no, being an artist was not an option in my life until boarding school mentors really made me feel like maybe that's a real path. So, it became this experience that through my life, I've thought like, wow, that was both the worst time of my life and some of the best times of my life. And how do I reconcile that? This place caused so much pain and also so much
Right. Right.
joy. So, I mean, that doesn't tell you much about the plot of the book. I mean, the book is really about me reckoning with that duality of like, how do I make peace with this place? The book is really plot wise about 5 students who get chosen to be part of the Circle, which is a very revered teachers writing group. And, obviously I think a lot about the power of writing and what it's done for me. So it's about how through their writing, these 5 students come to recognize the culture of abuse at the school and what they can do about it. And it's very different than Like a Love Story.
Mhm.
It's written largely in third person, which is pretty unusual for a YA
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, it is.
And I think a lot of the reason people write first person in YA is because it's so immediate.
Immediate. Yeah.
And I think I started writing the book in first person and it was feeling wrong to me. And when I started writing it in third person, it feels right. And what I came to realize is that I wanted this book to have slightly more detachment than a book like a love story, which I think is much more like you're immediately in the emotion. I wanted this
Yeah.
book to be a slightly more detached, hopefully still very emotional, but the characters in this book are even more flawed. So if people have problems with the characters in Like a Love Story,
Here's
I
your warning.
shudder to think what will happen. But so much of my life has been trying to come to terms with my own flaws, my own
Mhm.
journey, and the flaws of those I love. And I think that this book is really about how when there is a toxic culture, everybody becomes somehow involved, and figuring the way out is very tricky. And um, yeah, I hope people like it. It's very real. It's very much based, perhaps even more than Like a Love Story, based on real experiences, because Like a Love Story was very grounded emotionally, but none of that happened to me.
Mhm.
But in the Chandler Legacies, quite a bit of it did happen. And I don't know. I hope people like it. It's definitely, there is a warning at the beginning of the book because it's quite I suppose I felt that if I was going to tell this story, I had to be very grounded in the depictions of the hazing and the abuse. So it's definitely a challenging read. But again, like with Like a Love Story, the feeling I had at the end was one of power and hope and catharsis. And I hope
Right.
that's what readers will feel.
That note, I had a amazing time talking with you. It was such a fun conversation, and I loved whatever we spoke. It was such a diverse range of things. So thank you for all of it.
Thank you. No, thank you for, I mean, this, like I said, it means so much to me as someone who's lived in many countries throughout my life to know that I'm now reaching people in India is
Yeah.
mind blowing. So thank you.
Right.